Hi, welcome to Eduonix, and thank you for participating in today's exciting session to build, yourself something new with when it comes to your online training. My name is Vivek, your co-host, and I have with me Gray Lewis, who is our instructor for today, and we will be learning HTML and CSS in order to build a website for a concert. Now, before I get started, just wanted to open the chat window and just check if you guys can hear me clearly. So, if you are on the chat, can you just put yes on the chat quickly, please? All right. Okay, I see a lot of yeses. Thank you. Already 79 people in on a Saturday, on a weekend. I see 80 people in. Great. So we'll wait for another 30 seconds while we have other people to join us, and we will quickly have Gray to explain us everything with regards to how to go about using these technologies for getting into uh, the HTML and CSS. So one quick question for you guys quickly in one line, if you can just put it on the chat. Yes, before I proceed, Jeff, just to answer your question, yes, in case you miss out anything or if you want to go at your own pace, these sessions are recorded and these sessions will be added to your Eduonix panel after 24 hours from this session. So yeah, do not worry about not able to understand or you're not able to get what exactly Gray went through about. Don't worry. Your question, there will be a question and answers round. There will be free giveaways as a part of you being attending Eduonix online training sessions, as well as you will get an opportunity to speak to Gray to ask your questions regarding today's topic. Mahendra, today's session is going to be a 90-minute long session, and I see that there is about 100 plus people already who are joined in. So without taking much time, I will introduce Gray. Gray is one of a fantastic colleague who has been around for quite a while, and he's been working with Eduonix as an instructor. Since a very little age, he's actually got into this model of the entire concept of learning the mean stack. So he's not just experienced, but he's very friendly as well as he's open to your questions. So I'll keep the chat window open for each and every one of you. Just make sure that we listen to Gray first, and we'll allow him to complete his session. We will have Q&A round as well during the session. And by the way, don't go away. I forgot to mention to you, we have a few free giveaways as well as few offers for you lined up from Eduonix. So without taking much time, guys, I will start straight away, get this session started. Gray, I think, yeah, I can see you now here. Hi, Gray. Great. So I'll go on mute and let's get started. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening me. Gray, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I hope you are all having a fantastic weekend so far. Today, we're going to be covering the basics of CSS and HTML. So this is going to be quite an introductory sort of webinar into how the web works and, yeah, what makes up the websites that we're visiting. And it's important to note that the content that we'll be covering today, well, interesting in my opinion, and well, I will be trying to go in as depth as I possibly can. Is not necessarily going to be the final level that websites will be actually built at by developers working in the field. And what I mean by that is these are very basic tools, and a lot of tools have actually been built around these tools, an entire ecosystem of different libraries, frameworks, and products, which can really be put together and sort of built up to form something much more complex than what we're going to build today. But even those super complex, even the most complex like web app that you could build will ultimately be built on a foundation of HTML and CSS, which is quite an interesting sort of claim to make, right? But it's true. I think even though the majority of web developers actually find themselves spending most of their time in JavaScript, right, writing out the logic for how they want their data to flow and how they want the interface to work for the people who are interacting with it. It's all going to be based around this sort of foundation, right? We're going to be using the JavaScript, using more complex libraries like Angular, like React, to actually modify and make dynamic the fundamental core, which is this CSS and HTML that it all manipulates and centers around. So today I'm going to be just touching on what elements are, how CSS connects to these elements, and how we really construct the style and look of a web page, and sort of how those pieces come together. And hopefully, if this is your first time ever really being exposed to the web, this will demystify sort of the packages that come in over the internet and get loaded in your web browser. So to introduce myself, I'm Gray Lewis. As Vivek wonderfully introduced me, I am a full stack engineer, which means that I operate on all parts of the software technology stack, from the database to the front end. And I'm actually a user experience focused engineer, meaning that I'm always thinking about not only how these pieces function, but how the users will fundamentally interact with and experience that functioning. And that even goes for things like database schemas and everything, really. And so I hope that today I can share some of the knowledge that I've gained with you guys over the past 5 years that I've really been involved in the tech field. But yeah, today I'm hoping that we can cover this basic subject, but really get some working fundamental understanding for how these things work under the hood. So let's start with the absolute basics. What is HTML and what are we going to be accomplishing with it, right? So at a very fundamental level, HTML is considered to be a markup language. What that essentially means is that it is a language that does not only convey meaning through text, so English, right? But on top of that, we're including information for how that text should be presented, whether in a list of items or maybe in a few different regions on a web page, or maybe even including things like links or buttons, right? So we're able to add not just content, not just copy, not just information for people to consume, but really format it. And it's all going to happen in two files, which will be parsed together to form a hierarchy of elements with corresponding styles. And if any of you are at all active on web development Twitter, then you'll be somewhat familiar with the debate that rages on about whether HTML is considered a programming language. And it's ultimately just an argument of semantics. Some will say technically, since it doesn't define a logical set of instructions, that means that technically speaking, it's not a programming language. But I think that really, as someone who's coming new into web development or even development in general, HTML can actually be a really good first step into understanding how abstractions work and how syntax works in general. And so I would consider it to be somewhere in between a programming language and something less than that. I think that the people who argue that it's not might be a little bit reductionist. And because there really is a lot of depth to HTML, and most developers that you'll run into actually rush through the CSS and HTML aspects of web development. And I think there's actually a lot to know there, and a lot of functionality and dynamism that can actually be added just through these very basic parts of web development. So here we have our first actual example of what HTML looks like in practice, right? So you'll notice on the left here, I have the actual code. You'll see two layers, in a sense, of elements. We have this body element here, all the way to the left. And you'll notice that there are a corresponding opening and closing tags, right? So we have the opening tag here and the closing tag here. And anything in between these tags will be considered to be children of that element. So that's how we actually define the hierarchical relationship between these elements. It comes down to where tags are in our code. So you'll notice then we also have a opening and closing tag for the paragraph element. And you'll also notice that here in the opening tag, we have an attribute called class. And so there's a few key pieces of information in this declarative phrase that we have here, right? So we have the P indicating what type of element it is. In this case, we're talking about a paragraph. Then we have a key value pair here, class equals paragraph. And the word paragraph is actually quite arbitrary, but it is essentially a name that I'm giving to this element. So the specific, we can call this specific instance of the paragraph element paragraph, right? Which honestly, maybe I could have chosen a less confusing name, but this paragraph now has an alias, shall we say, an alias. And then we see inside there's actually this text, right? So this text is considered to be a child, to be inside, to be content of this paragraph element based on how it is just opened and closed, right? So we see the three layers, this hierarchy forming, and we see how this attribute is added to add extra information to annotate what these elements mean and how we can refer to them. And so here we have these 4 key points. Write these down if you're taking any notes. This is exactly what you need to know. There are parents, there are children, there are different types of elements. They are declared using these opening and closing tags, and they can also be named. So now I'm going to be getting into a little higher level of a conception of HTML, because one thing we have to realize is that websites are actually consumed in many different forms and by many different kinds of people, right? So we have to consider the wide variety of forms and formats that our website might be rendered in. And so one thing that means that we actually won't be touching on too much is that we have to consider the size of the screen that our content is being rendered on. We call that responsiveness. But it also means that we have to think about things like accessibility, right? So people are not just consuming the web on a browser. Some people are actually using a screen reader. People who maybe can't see might have to hear the web. They might have to have websites read aloud to them. And so we have to consider all of the information that we're actually packing in here. And as you'll notice in HTML, there's actually quite a bit of info packed in to very basic syntax. So when we say, oh, this is a paragraph, that actually holds a very deep context to it. And so we can help people who are maybe consuming content in a non-visual format by really clearly labeling and annotating all of the content on the page. So by really making sure that our HTML is semantic, meaning that it contains information about itself in its own form, it is self-explanatory to read in a way. That is what we mean by semantic here. We're adding extra information that can be consumed by people who might not be able to actually see our website. And that includes search engine optimization, for example, right? So Google, when indexing the web, isn't actually viewing the website, isn't actually looking at the visual content of the website to understand what it is, but is rather just using a bot, right, to scrape the website and consider the content. And so we have to understand that that's also a type of agent that's going to be consuming our data, and it's going to affect the functioning of our website and how it shows up in Google results, which is also an important consideration. So These things are actually quite standardized. One of the challenges of the web is that we don't have one centralized controlled platform like something like Apple would, right? So Apple has their Mac OS operating system. They have complete control over the platform. And so you can really expect an app to function exactly the same on any Mac device. However, because we have these different browsers, because it's an open standard, we have to really think about standardization. And that's where organizations like the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, come in, because they allow us to define these HTML and CSS standards and really set a very clear expectation for how these files will be parsed. So as developers, we have to have a very clear understanding of what the rules are. And this organization tells us those rules. They standardize those rules and they publish them publicly so that everyone understands and so the browsers can conform to those standards. And they very clearly lay out expectations for how these different elements should be used and what the meaning of these semantic elements is. And we already touched briefly on accessibility, but we really must consider how these HTML elements will be parsed and understood by people who can't see the browser. And we'll see how, we'll now dive a little bit into these individual elements and how they are actually related to this accessibility concern. So here we have examples of what are called generic elements. What that means is they are not semantic. We don't get any extra information about the content of these elements based on their type, right? So here we have a div and a span. A div is what we'd call a block level element. You can sort of imagine that this is an element that is part of the layout. It affects all of the other things on the page. You can see here a sort of diagram for what I mean here. We have these block level elements that are sort of stacked on top of each other and vertical. And you see they also actually by default take up the full width of the container, the parent element that they are in. So you have these three elements, and you'll notice that they actually shift each other, right? So the fact that there are three elements here is going to affect the position of each of those on the page. They impact each other's positioning on the vertical axis. And then here we have the inline type of element, which is kind of the opposite, right? So we have, they are not as seriously affecting the layout, as substantially affecting the layout, and they actually only affect each other on the horizontal axis. So they are meant to sort of be content in a sense, right? So they are within block level elements, and that's the sort of basic inline versus block level distinction. So spans ultimately only affect the layout of their parent element, whereas block level elements affect the layout of the whole page. And that's a pretty broad generalization, but that is I think a very good surface level understanding for the difference between these two elements. And then here we have the counterpart to generic elements, semantic elements, right? So we have a list. And you see here how like you can see here more clearly the distinction between a generic and semantic element, right? So a list denotes a very specific form of information. We know a lot about how that information is going to be presented. Here we have two types of elements, UL and OL, both of which actually are lists. One is an unordered list and one is an ordered list. And here you see one of the examples where this extra information comes into play, right? So an ordered list denotes that it's actually going to be numbered, right? So maybe 1, 2, 3, 4. Each item actually has an order to it in the list. Could also be A, B, C, D, for example. And so now the screen reader or whatever is parsing that content has more information about what that content is and how it's what form it's going to come in. And then over here we have images, which are another semantic element. which, as you can imagine, are used for the display of images. And so one thing that's important for is just handling the attachment of media, right? So this semantic element does the job of giving us a way to embed images into HTML and actually get some fine-grained control over that image's size, over its cropping, and even doing things like adding filters and etc. But it also gives information to the browser, right? So now the browser knows, oh, this is going to be an image. This is important for things like optimization. It's important for accessibility, as we've mentioned, and it's important for a whole lot. So you can see how HTML is a lot more than just sort of setting up a bunch of divs and spans and just styling them so that they're appropriate. We're also going to actually be considering the user experience even this early on, even in the HTML phase of development, which is the most basic really level of web development that we could do. And so now we move on to HTML's counterpart, CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheet. And basically what it comes down to is a series of instructions for how the browser should style these HTML elements. So for example, what color the text is, what size the text is, what font family the text is going to be in, the sort of whatever images that we have in, maybe we want to do some fancy things like apply filters, anything like that is all going to be done in CSS. But it's actually really a high level set of standards and layout tools at this point. And we see as CSS evolves more and more, they keep adding higher level layout construction and formatting tools, which get more and more powerful. And you'll see later on how these layout systems end up being sort of almost a programming language in themselves in a way, because they have such high flexibility and there are so many different approaches. And it actually becomes a bit of an engineering problem. And that's actually one of my favorite things about working with HTML and CSS is it's an engineering problem, but it's also a artistic problem, right? So we're dealing with how things look and feel to interact with, but it's also a bit of a puzzle, right? A bit of a challenge, a bit of an engineering problem. So let's get into how these actual CSS values are defined and what the syntax looks like. And first, I want to do that using the example of spatial values. And what do I mean by spatial values? All I'm trying to communicate is these are values that determine distances and lengths of the screen, of elements on the screen, right? So we can define how tall, how wide something is using spatial values. Pixels are an example of a spatial value where we could say, oh, I want this to be 100 pixels by 100 pixels, right? And we've defined now how that element looks in a 2D space. And so there are a bunch of different units we can actually use for defining these values. I'm going to rush through that because I want to get to the demo, and this is a little bit beyond the scope of today's lesson, but I do want to give you just a bit of context. These are 3 units that we can use in CSS to define distances, lengths, margins, anything that has to do with spatial, like the positioning or width, height, spatial values, right? We have EMs, which essentially just corresponds to the current set font size. So that's useful for when we want to do things like maybe add one space, the equivalent of one line of text between 2 elements. We have percentages, which operate relative to screen width. You can imagine how being able to define things width or size relative to the actual screen they're being rendered on can be useful for making sure that websites render consistently across different devices. And then here we have view widths and view heights, which are actually pretty much the same as percentages, but rather than operating on what the browsers, rather than operating on sort of the percentage relative to the parent, or relative to whatever container the element is in, it's actually being defined exactly relative to the screen size. So percentages are relative to the screen size if they're at the top level, and then defined relative to the parent element that they're contained in if they are a child. And I'll be actually going through an example of these percentage values, and you'll see how those work in action. And now we have positioning values. Also, note here the syntax that we're using for CSS, right? So we have these little declarative statements that we've shown at the bottom using these 3 different units. We have an identifier here, dot class, which refers to those names that we can define in HTML, if you'll remember. So we can indicate which elements we're talking about using a identifier like this. Then we have curly braces, brackets, depending on where you're from. And then we have these key value pairs, which define actual values for properties. So the width here is being determined as 30% of whatever this element is in. So this is the basic syntax for how CSS works. We have, we have a element that we need to apply the styles to, and then we have individual aspects of that element's style / look that we start to define line by line. And it goes property, colon, value, semicolon. And you'll see that pattern over and over again. And so now we also have the positioning property. So there's sort of these 4, I think it's 5 or 6 different positioning systems in a way, right? So we can define how the position is actually set. So for example, we have the default static type of positioning where we are basically going to just respect how the other elements are on the page, meaning there won't be overlapping elements taking up the same space, and also that those positioning values themselves actually won't do much. But then we have relative positioning, which is going to allow us to nudge statically positioned elements just a little bit. So we're going to respect the position of other elements on the page, and then we're going to just nudge them based on where we end up after that fact. So I can be like, okay, I want this to be 20 pixels lower, and it'll just be shifted 20 pixels down. This is a bit hard to imagine in the abstract if you've never looked at CSS before, but again, we will get to the demo shortly. And then we have absolute positioning, which basically allows us to treat the screen like a Cartesian plane, right? Where we can just say, I want this element to be 40 pixels from the lower left-hand side of my browser window and 50 pixels from the bottom. And so we can really just kind of set these coordinates, and it will also, in that case, ignore all of the other elements that might be in on that part of the screen, right? So we can use that to sort of ignore the positioning of other elements and really just sort of the most simple type of positioning that we can imagine. So here you have an example of how these actual values are interpreted, right? So we have a left, top, bottom, and right value, each of which correspond in the absolute system of positioning to offsets, right? So if I set this value here, this left arrow, this left value to be 20px, that means that this element here will be 20 pixels from the left-hand side of our browser window. And obviously the same for the top, bottom, and right positioning for their corresponding directions. And like I said, these numbers, these top, left, right, and bottom values will be interpreted slightly differently based on which positioning value, which positioning method we'll be using: absolute, static, relative, sticky, etc. And so now let's move on to one more key concept in CSS, and that's margins and padding. So when we talk about margins, we're talking about the space around elements. You're probably used to the term margin from thinking about maybe Word documents, Microsoft Word documents, or even just how books are formatted, right? So we have space around elements. And then we have padding, which is space within elements. So maybe there's text and we want to have a certain amount of space within that element, just sort of encapsulating the content. And here you can actually see what that means, right? So the margin is this space around the element. I'm going to define a certain amount of empty space around this element that won't be encroached upon by other elements. And then padding is sort of that, but within the element itself. So I have content inside the element, and I want to add some space between that content and the edge of the element that it is in. And that's how padding operates within an HTML document. So there are a lot of different ways to affect an element's size, position, etc., using all of these different sort of attributes, right? So I want to open up, before we get too much deeper in, is there anything that's really unclear in the explanations I've just given? Is there anything you guys want to cover a little more? PX stands for pixels. So it's the fundamental level of our screen, right? So we're just going to define it as an actual point of light being rendered by our screen. All right, it looks like we are pretty much ready to move on. So now we're getting into the higher level concepts in HTML and CSS. We have Flexboxes, which are a super powerful layout tool. So you can imagine from the sort of attributes and methods that we've laid out already, padding, margins, and these positioning systems, it can be super complex to solve a super simple problem like centering on a screen. So if I wanted to center an element on the screen just by instructing it a certain amount of these, just by giving it a certain amount of these CSS styles that we've gone through before, that's quite a difficult thing to do, actually, because the screen size is going to be different for each person using it. So we can't just set a certain amount of pixels until it's in the center of the screen. We also can't just like use these percentages because the element itself will take up some space and sort of shift that a little bit. And yeah, it's sort of hard to actually get centering working in CSS. And so that's where these kind of systems come in. There's these sort of layout construction frameworks, almost, these modules in CSS that give us very powerful sets of tools for handling these layout systems in a very simple way, using much less code. So for example, we have the Flexbox, and that's what we'll be using a lot today during the demonstration. We have a parent element which acts as the box, right? So the Flexbox itself. And then within this Flexbox will be a certain amount of children. You can see an illustration on the presentation here for how these actually end up being positioned within the container. So we have this line around these three boxes, right? This container around these three boxes. The container surrounding the boxes is the Flexbox. And then the children are these actual squares and rectangles that we have inside. And you can see how, depending on how we set the justify content property of the Flexbox, we're affecting the positioning quite greatly. So we can do things like have these elements be evenly spread out in a line, and squash things to either side and then have one in the middle. We can also center all of the elements and put them close together. We can squash them towards the end of the Flexbox. We can squash them towards the beginning of the Flexbox, etc. Right? So we have, this is just one of the attributes that we can set on a Flexbox to actually make its layout function as we want. And this is really, really powerful, and there's a lot to it. So I'm not going to take too much time going through all of the different flex properties, but you can imagine how this tool can really build on top of itself and be used to form really complex layouts that are responsive to the size of the screen and other factors. And so here are some key points about Flexboxes and the different properties that we would manipulate on a Flexbox. So in order to set a container as a Flexbox, we use display Flexbox as so, and this, or just display flex. And then we can actually use the align content and justify content values to set how these are aligned on the primary axis. And then let me break this down actually a little more clearly. Let me restart here. So every Flexbox has a certain direction, right? So it's going to have a primary axis and a secondary axis. So by default, it's going to be in a row. So it's going to be on the horizontal axis. And you can change how the elements are distributed along this axis using the justify content CSS property. Then you can define the how they are distributed on the secondary axis. So in the case of this default setup for a Flexbox on the vertical axis, right? And how it's distributed on that axis. And then we use flex direction to actually define which axis is primary and which one is secondary. So it comes down to whether really you want a row of items or a column of items. And then we can define both how those items are distributed on the primary axis, so vertically in a column or horizontally in a row, and also on that secondary axis. So that was a lot of content. The Flexbox is a super complex tool. So hopefully once we get into the demonstration, if there are any real things that need to be clarified, we can do just that. And yes, so what I want to do now is sort of hop into the demo and really talk about what we're going to be breaking down today. What we're going to be doing is doing a little walkthrough of constructing this fake concert website for Kendrick Lamar's imaginary concert, which will never happen thanks to coronavirus and isn't a real concert. So we have a fake production company called Accidental Productions. We can imagine that maybe this is a client who came to us, and we're going to be going from the absolute basics, not having any ideas, and building this actual website. Obviously, I've built this ahead of time so that I can really quickly run line by line. Yeah, so let's really imagine the process of getting this request from a client, right? So first we get a request from a client. The client might say, I want this website to accomplish this goal. And I might take that information, might take that request and start building an actual mock-up, right? So this is what a mock-up looks like. We have just a little basic document that sort of has the layout, has the idea, shows the basic concept. Obviously, this isn't a real website, but we can see what we want to make now. This is super basic website layout, obviously. Nothing super fancy going on here because I want to have time to really break down the styling of it. But yeah, this is what we want to do. And you'll notice here that we have an image that we're going to have to embed, where we have a few different places where we're going to have separate layouts, right? So we're going to have a bar up here for one layout. This is going to have to be maybe a flex box as well. There's a bunch of different elements here. We also have this background image that we have to deal with. So there's a lot of different things that we want to actually build here in HTML and CSS. And so from this phase, we can really just go ahead and start writing the code, right? In real life situations, there are two main key differences between the process that I'll be running you through today. One, it's actually very rare to use raw HTML and CSS. There are lots of tools, lots of what we would call pre-processing as well, that people use to really make the job of writing HTML and CSS quite a bit easier and to make the tools more flexible. And also, it's rare that a website would be this simple, right? So we're really just kind of making a basic layout. And also, we're not going to be doing responsive design, which is to say, typically we would expect the majority of our web traffic to actually come from users on their phones. So we would probably design the website for a phone first, and then make it so that it adapts based on how the screen gets bigger. But in this case, we'll just be building a one version of the website for our desktop screen size for simplicity's sake. So with all of that out, let's actually get into the code and start actually learning how we can build this website. So let me share the actual IDE that we'll be working in. If you guys want to follow along, it should be somewhat doable for people who are used to following coding tutorials. If not, that's no concern. There's the code will be shared online as well as the recording of this webinar as well. So if you want to maybe take it a bit slower, just go back through it after the fact and try again. But I'll try to go slow enough that you guys can keep up. I see that a lot of people are asking questions about things like media queries, more advanced questions, Bootstrap. I'm really trying to keep this the scope of this more of an introductory lesson for people who have never really worked on the web before. So I'm happy to answer questions about that during the Q&A phase if that's something that people are interested in. But I do want to get through this demo for the people who came here for an introductory webinar. So let's get started here. So I've created an index.html file. One important thing to note is I'll be using a tool called live server reload or something like that. Yeah, live server by Ritwick Day. This is a super useful plugin for VS Code. It'll just basically serve HTML and CSS on a constantly updating URL. So we won't have to actually refresh the page every time we make a change in our style. It'll just do that for us whenever it notices differences in the code, right? So whenever we change the code. So every time we get started with a basic HTML project, we can use what is called an emit abbreviation to fill out the boilerplate. So in VS Code, if you just press exclamation point and then enter, it will give you the basic scaffolding of a website. This is some metadata that we really don't have to concern ourselves with, but it basically comes down to that those non-human consumers of this information that we were talking about before, like web scrapers, right? So this metadata is really there for the browser to understand how to interpret the information, and also for potentially non-human users who might need information that isn't necessarily included in the visual aspect of the website. Then we have the title, which is actually just that little bit of text that we displayed in the tab of Google Chrome or whatever browser people are using. I'll go ahead and just set that to Kendrick Lamar concert. And then we have the two main sections of the page that we can see here. There's one element called head, which is encapsulating all of this non-rendered content. And then we have the body, which is where our actual content that is going to be rendered onto the page goes. So within our body here, we're going to start actually laying out the website. So if we remember what our mock-up looked like, we had a background, we had that little navigation bar at the top, as well as a logo. And then we had that button, and we had the title with Kendrick Lamar's name, and then the information right below it. So we'll just go ahead and actually lay that out quickly. So the first thing I'll do is create a container that we will use to sort of lay out all of our things overall. I'm going to also be using a shortcut here. I believe this is actually also an emit abbreviation. If you write div.container like so, and then you press enter, so it will use the autocomplete for the emit abbreviation, we will get a div named container. So that's just a little shortcut for us, right? We can just name the type of element, dot, and then the name of the element, press enter, and it will just generate that element for us. And that will really help with the speed. So we make the container. I'm going to also add in the background div right there. And then we are going to start with the header section. So here's where our semantic elements come in. There's a semantic element called section, which, as you can imagine, is built for sectioning off your website into main areas. The first area that we'll be laying out is going to be the header. So just that top bit. And so we're going to name this header. And then we are actually also going to need to make the logo there for us. And keep in mind that there's not much going on here yet. It's just the very basic scaffolding of the website. And then we're going to use an image here. I am going to need to copy my images folder. So there's 4 main images that we'll be embedding into our website. There's this background image that we saw when we were looking at it, the small version of the background image, and then this logo and the bigger version. So basically, generally in web, we have different images to load based on how big the screen is. I actually will be skipping that, but that's just an important thing to note. And so, yes, we have this header section now. Actually, within that section as well, I'm going to add the nav bar that we talked about. And also, I'm going to name this class logo. So we can see how we're sort of getting into a more complex hierarchy of elements already. There might be a few elements. There are a few elements that those of you who are not familiar with HTML are going to be surprised by. The first one here is nav. So you'll see here that if we hover over these things, it gives us a reference from MDN, which is the Mozilla Foundation's reference website. And we'll see the nav element represents a section of the page that links to other pages or to parts within a page, a section with navigation links. And this is just those semantic, this is just part of that semantic standard that we were talking about before, right? So we're giving information about what each piece of the website actually is and what its function and form and what content it has in it. So this is a nav, meaning it's a navigation bar. And now people with screen readers will know that this is where they need to look for links to other parts of the website. And keep in mind, we're not going to be building any of the other pages for this website, so these links are meaningless. They will be going nowhere. But typically, they would link to other web pages. So let's start by actually, do you guys want to make the HTML piece by piece and then go through the styles of each part? Or would you prefer if I did all the HTML first and then all of the styles second? Okay, I think most people are saying all the HTML first, so let's do it that way. So then we're going to do the same thing, but actually using for the rest of the content, right? So we're going to make another section. I'm going to call it main. So this is the main section. And then we're going to copy these elements in for the title and the link to go book a ticket. So we're going to go. You can also, just do .title, which will default to a div. But I like, just for my own mental purposes of just keeping track of everything and being as explicit with myself as possible, to just write div there. And then I'm going to actually write in the text that we want to be rendered here. So this is the title, and we're going to call it Kendrick Lamar, right? Because that's the big text right in the center of the screen there. Then we're going to go div.concert.info. Whoops, a little typo there. And then we will paste in these 2 spans here. I'm encoding here this little encoded element. Sometimes in HTML, you have to escape characters. What that means is some characters aren't really friendly for computers to parse and insert. So we have these special codes for inserting them. This is a bullet point, right? So it'll be rendered just like a big circle, big little dot. And then we have that one last piece here, the call to action, the link to actually go buy a ticket, hence the class name CTA. So this is the majority of our website, or it's all of our website, really. We have to do one more thing here, which is to actually connect up the different files that we'll be using to influence this HTML, but we're basically done. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually embed a font that will allow us to use the font self-explanatorily, but without it being installed on our users' computers. So that's what this link element is for. Also, I saw that someone was asking if they could see the photos so they could use it in their markup. I'm going to go ahead and send out the GitHub repository for this project, so you guys can go there, download whatever pieces you need as reference. But yes, so we have these two links to embed a font, and then there's one more linked resource that we're going to inform our HTML about, and that is the CSS file that we'll be using, stylesheet.css. So I'll create a new file called stylesheet.css, and now in this file, we'll start actually declaring the styles. So it looks like we're actually running a bit ahead of schedule. So I have some time to answer some questions before we move on from the HTML. So is there any questions that you guys have about the HTML so far, just the HTML? I'm going to scroll through the chat and see if there was anything asked earlier. Someone asked, what is the use of nav? Yeah, like I said, these elements don't really affect the actual functioning of the names of the elements don't typically impact the functioning of the elements too much, except in the cases of things like buttons and forms. But it's just extra information for accessibility, right? So we're just kind of using these special element types to delineate what parts of the page are what. And since it's pretty standard to have a navigation bar on almost every website, the HTML standard includes a nice little element for denoting that part of the page. HTML4 and HTML5 difference. I mean, there's a lot of difference. It's just like every time there's a new standard, they add a bunch of different features, a bunch of new elements. HTML5 was especially focused on these semantic elements. But yeah, I mean, if you're really interested in all of the details, you can look up the specs and really read through the differences. What if we use a div for replacing the section? So again, theoretically, you could just make every element a div and you'd be fine, right? You could deal with it, even though there are some default styles you'd have to override. You could style divs to be every element, right? But then you're going to make your website a lot less accessible to people who can't see it. So we use the section element to make it more accessible to people who can't see our website. That also includes people like bots, right? People, users like bots who are just there to consume the information, see what's there, and they're not going to even render it. They're just going to look through the markup to see what the content is. So it's really important to try to use semantic elements as often as possible. You don't need to understand the metadata. I'm not going to go through it right now. These are just basic things that you really just, this is boilerplate, we would call it. You'll just write that the same time every time, and it really doesn't affect the functioning of your website substantially. So if you're super interested, look it up. Eventually, it's probably a useful thing to know, but it's slightly beyond the scope of this webinar. As people have been spamming in chat, the editor I'm using is VS Code. What is at #8226? As I said, this is an encoded character. So if we actually go to open up, if we go and open up this website by going to HTML, right-clicking and opening with that live server plugin that we were mentioning earlier, and then I go ahead and just share the output so far, we'll see that where I put that information, we're just rendering a bullet point, right? So it's just Saturday, March 27th, bullet point, $50 entry fee. And you'll notice it's quite ugly right now. There's really nothing here. That's because we haven't styled it quite yet. But yes, so that little escaped character is just a bullet point. All right, so now that we have answered some of those questions, let's go move over to the styling. So let's go to our style sheet here and let's start moving. Let's start thinking about this. So the first thing I'm going to do is define how our container works. So as I mentioned before, this is the syntax for declaring out CSS styles. I also mentioned Flexboxes, right? So we're going to set display flex to make this a Flexbox. And then what we'll do is we'll set the flex direction to column, meaning that it'll be organized vertically. And then we'll make sure that the width of this bad boy is 100%. So nothing much has changed yet. We're just setting the basic parameters for how this container is going to be there. Then we're going to style the background. That's that background image we mentioned before. So there's two things that we could do here. We could actually put an image in the div here. You'll notice I didn't put an image here. Or we can use a background image. So this is a CSS tool, right? So first of all, let me give width 100% and height 100% just to make sure the background's going to cover everything. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set that background image that I was talking about. So to do that, we just use a property like so. We're going to use the URL function and then pass in the relative path, which we can copy using VS Code right in there. And then there we go. Now we will need to actually make sure that we're using the right kind of slash there. But yes, so now we've linked the actual image to the URL where our image is at. And then we can set the size of our background image using background size to cover. And what that means is we're going to make sure that the image is covering the whole element. And then we're going to set this little value here, background position -y. That's just to give an offset of the image. So I'm trying to center the actual people on stage. So that's what that's going to do. And then we'll use the absolute positioning style and a Z index of 1. So Z index corresponds to the order from back to front, right? So something with a higher Z index will cover anything with a lower Z index. And then we're going to style our logo. So I'm going to add a little margin here just to offset it from the top left side. And then we have the title. This is going to receive a few styles. First of all, we're going to use text align center. That's going to do exactly what you'd imagine, right? Just justify that text to the center. And then we're going to set the font using this property. So this is what we call a shorthand property, meaning we're defining a lot of different values at once. We're telling it it's a bold font. We're telling it the size of that font, and we're telling it what font family to use. We'll be using Spartan, which is that font that we embedded in the HTML. So let's actually take a look now at what our website looks like. So I'm going to actually start sharing my whole screen here so that we can see everything, right? So here we are here. I'm going to open up our website. So we see that the website's sort of starting to look different. If you use the inspect element tool, you'll be able to actually see all the individual elements as they are on the page. You can literally right click on an element and click inspect to get to that element in the HTML. And it will show us all of the properties that we've set. So here we have margin top 10, margin left 10, and we can even see how those are being impacted. And now we'll notice there's this weird white outline around our whole screen. And that's actually a problem of the default styles that HTML is going to give our web page. So if I go back here and I set a style sheet for overriding the margin of the body, we'll see that that will be fixed, and now that's gone. So as I was saying, all of these elements actually do have some default CSS styles. Links, for example, by default have these different colors to them and are underlined. The body is by default has that small margin on the sides. Many little things like that you do have to consider are affected, right? So the HTML actually does affect the CSS, the styling a little bit sometimes. So let's keep going piece by piece and getting through with this. But before I do that, I'm going to actually take a little break. My colleague is going to take back over, talk to you guys a little bit about where you can start to actually move forward with your knowledge base after this webinar if you're interested in web development. And I'll be back in just a little bit. So thank you guys for being attentive. I'll be right back. We'll finish up this styling and have a little Q&A session. So thank you guys for being such a great audience. I will be right back.
All right, thank you, Gray, and yes, thank you, everyone. I would actually appreciate everyone's patience to being so kind and also being attentive during this session. So I'll just take the screen share. Gray, if you can just stop the screen share, I can get the screen share right away. All right, thank you. All right. Okay, guys. Okay, first of all, you've been so attentive. Thank you for that. We'll definitely share a few things which are going to help you out with your training. But quickly, just wanted to inform you that we are Eduonix is coming up with live online training sessions, and this actually talks about the angular degree. So now what we're going to do is we actually have already opened our registrations for the online angular e-degree, wherein you can just enroll, use the link and enroll yourself for this upcoming session. This is this is like a once in a lifetime opportunity. Because why? Because we have ongoing sessions right away from January throughout the entire year. We are covering different topics, be it the machine learning, be it the mean stack. Now we're looking at the angular part as well. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to share a link in the chat box which will allow you to register. We have got limited seats, so just make sure that you're not missing out on registering yourself. Best part is you don't have to worry about sacrificing your work or your study time. All you have to do is just be there online for the sessions every Saturday and Sunday, 2 p.m. GMT time. That starts 3rd April. Now what this also does is also gives you an opportunity to interact with our instructor with all your in-depth sessions. Now the first question, even as a audience, which would come to your mind is, I need to do a practical to understand this session, or rather what Gray is teaching. I would love to have a practical session about this. There are many in real-time interactions, as well as there are mini assignments which are going to be part of this learning session, which is going to start on the 3rd of April. There is a similar global instructor who is equally experienced, equally friendly, and she is also full of energy. Her name is Aarti. She's going to be your instructor during this this session, which is going to start on the 3rd of April. So I will quickly share the link during the session, but yeah, we will make sure that we will complete our today's session as well. Also during the Q&A, I'll also take care of the questions along with Dre, so that we have maximum topics covered for you today. All right. So yeah, stay tuned. I'll share the registration link, and also I haven't forgotten that I have to give you a free goodie today for your patience and your attendance today. All right. So Gray, are you back?
Hi, yes, I am.
All right, great. So okay, I've stopped my screen share. If you are ready, we can continue with our discussion.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right.
Yeah, let me get my screen shared again. All right, here we are. Oh, looks like my video is a bit overexposed. Give me 1 sec to fix that. Oh, that's too dark. There we go. Yeah, so let me get that screen sharing back up. 1 second, guys. All right, so let's get back to it. Let's finish up this layout so we can get into that Q&A session. It does look like we are running just a bit tight on time, so I will try to keep things concise. So yes, you can see all of these different elements. We can sort of see all of their individual styles and even really start to see how these values affect it, right? So if we start setting and unsetting these values, we can really notice the difference. So we're just adding this little bit of space around the block with this margin value, for example. Within the background, we can see how if I turn off the Y position, it shifts the background up and down a little bit. And you can start to maybe, if you are currently going along with me, really, you know, mess around with the page, understand what all of these values are doing. This is like, you know, one of those very useful tools that will help you learn and understand and contextualize how HTML and CSS interact. So I highly recommend that you just go on the inspect element tool on Chrome and really just mess around, because obviously it is a bit much to absorb all of this information all at once if you are a real beginner to CSS especially. But yes, so let's keep moving then. So we have gotten to styling the title. Let's go ahead and just style the little line of text below that now. So the class name is concert info. And then we are going to do a few things. First, we're going to set that shorthand font attribute that we set for the title as well. We're going to set the color to white in a similar way. You're also noticing you also might notice that I'm sort of spacing these things out and formatting my code. VS Code screen is not shared. Is it? Oh, yeah, I see it's sharing the wrong screen now. That should do the trick. There we go. Thanks for letting me know, guys. Right, so we see that all of these different attributes are actually sort of formatted in the code itself. I'm sort of grouping them in these little groups and putting line breaks in between them. This is just to make them more navigatable, right? So I can scroll through, I can see, oh, this is where all the background information is set. This is where the width and height and the size things are set, right? So I try to really kind of just break up my code to make it a little more readable, because especially with CSS, it does get a bit verbose and kind of hard to understand at first glance. And then, yeah, we're going to set 0.8 opacity as well, just to make that a little bit stand out a little bit less, give a little bit of contrast to the title over the concert info itself. So if we go back to our render page, we can see that we've done quite a bit here now. And then additionally, what we're going to do is I'm going to style that date. So you'll notice that here we have the date and the concert info. We're going to style both, although it seems that it's already applied the styles just for clarity's sake. I will do that anyway. And then one more thing, we're going to actually style that header. So remember, sometimes in CSS, sometimes we're applying styles to parents and sometimes we're applying styles to children. So this container element, we would call it, isn't really visible on the screen. Like if I looked at this screen for someone, I said, where is this header element we're defining? It's not really there, right? You can't see it, but it affects all of the other layouts, all of the other elements, layouts and styles, because it is a parent element. The children are sort of moved and styled relative to the parent's position and style as well. So that's why it's important to really that's why we have to do things like putting display flex on a container element. And then we're going to do the same thing for that little nav we mentioned earlier. I'm going to set it to being a flex box. I'm going to give it some margins just to space it out. And then I'll be setting that font and the color of that font as well, just like we did with the other elements. And then here is a little fancy syntax that we are not familiar with yet. So in CSS, we have a bunch of different ways to select elements. This is one of them. So here I'll be targeting any A element that is a child of a nav element. So if we go back to our HTML here, we'll see that there is a nav element right here. And then within these A elements are links, really. It is a hyperlink. And so any hyperlink inside of the navigation bar will be given the styles that we're about to define. So this is one more way that we can be specific, add specificity, and target different elements. And so here we're going to just do a few things. We're going to get rid of that underline that links have by default. We're going to set the opacity to 0.8 just to lower the emphasis a bit. And then we're going to give it a little margin. So if we flip back to our page now, we can see that there is these elements, although they're kind of hard to see with the purple. We can fix that by doing this. So these are called pseudo selectors. And what that means is these are not really elements. I'm not selecting all A elements at all. I'm actually selecting A elements that are in a particular state that match a certain condition. And that condition is that they've been visited already. So when links are clicked, by default, they turn purple. I mean, that's probably something you guys are familiar with just by browsing the web, right? So to override that, we can use these pseudo selectors and change that value. So when things are visited, they're not going to change their color. They're just going to stay white. And then we're going to do another styling thing on a container element, that main container, and we're going to be doing that so we can center the items. First thing we're going to be doing, setting that flex value, so making sure this is a flex box now, and then we're going to set the direction to column so that the items will be aligned on a vertical axis, and then we're going to use that align items CSS attribute to center them. So you guys will remember there's the justify versus align values for Flexboxes. Align is going to align them, is going to lay them out on the secondary axis. So because this is a column, we'll be centering them horizontally. So in the center of our screen on the horizontal axis. And because it's the reason it's not content and it's items is because we're going to actually be centering the individual items in the center rather than centering the whole Flexbox. Then we will simply set a width 100 as well as a margin from the top. So if we go back now, we can see that this page is really coming together. Now everything seems to be centered, everything except for this book now button, which is kind of boring. But really everything is looking pretty good. So let's finish up that last piece by styling call to action, which is by far actually the most styled element in this document. So again, we're using this dot selector with the classes, and then we're going to set that width and height quite manually here to pixel values. We can not quite see it yet because it doesn't have a background color, but if we do set a background color, we do get rid of that default underline, and then we are going to set a box shadow. Now we can see it's starting to get styled. So this box shadow attribute is actually dropping a shadow. So if we go here back into our HTML, we right click on the book now button, and then we unclick this box shadow attribute. We can see it's adding this little nice red styled shadow below our element. And you can see here in the actual CSS that there's a bunch of values here. The first one is the horizontal offset of the shadow, so 0, because we don't want it to be to the right or left of the object. We just want it to be in line with the object on the horizontal axis. Then the vertical offset, so it's going to be 10 pixels below our element. And then the color, which we're specifying in RGBA format. So red value, green value, blue value, and then opacity. So that is what makes up this little box shadow here. And then we are going to go ahead and add a couple more things. We're going to add a margin to the top as well as a border radius. You'll see here that I use 999 EM. This is sort of shorthand for maximum, right? So just a huge value that's going to maximize the border radius. And the border radius is that rounded look, right? So we're adding a radius. We're rounding the border into being this sort of circular shape. And then we're going to style the text, much like we've done throughout. We're going to add a text align value to put it in the center. We're going to use that shorthand value for the font, and we're going to be setting a line height value. What that means is I'm actually vertically aligning this by setting how high each line of text is. You can do that by making the height the same as the line height. You'll notice here that's slightly higher than I wanted it to be, so I just added another 5 pixels just to make it look a little more centered. So if we close it and look at our website now in its full glory, we can see that it's looking good. Pretty much matching the mock-up that we wanted, which is basically all we can ask for, right? And so basically we are done now. I'm seeing that there's a slight bug here where this is more offset. And to deal with that, I'm just going to go here, check what's actually happening. And we see that this margin left is more substantial than we actually wanted. So we'll just go ahead and modify that, set that to 40, not as low as we want, set it to 20, still not as low as we want, set it to 0 maybe. And yeah, that's a little nicer. So we actually recognize there's quite a little value there that's off, making things look different, and we modify it until it looks how we want. And maybe even I'll put 2 EMs down. No, I'll keep it 1. And yeah, so that's the basic way that we would lay out a website using raw HTML and CSS. And also one more thing I want to tweak. I want this sort of white rectangular box here on the stage to be centered, just because I think it looks cool. And so to do that, I'm going to use this background position offset that we set earlier, and I'm just going to modify it until it's looking how I want. So that was actually the wrong direction. Still not quite as centered in the way I want it. That's still not, and that's exactly how I want it to look. So you see how it's sort of trial and error in a lot of ways with CSS and HTML. I think one key thing that you guys really should take away from this, and honestly, if there's anything any person, any teacher, any instructor can really needs to get through to you, it's that it's not going to be about actually memorizing all of this information that I've just given you. You need to be good at Googling it, because CSS and HTML is huge. There's such incredible depth you could go into, which is just not really necessary to know by heart. Instead, really familiarize yourself with the fundamental principles of HTML and focus on being able to research problems when they come up. Focus on knowing where to look. Focus on knowing what resources to look for and how to Google, because that is the absolute key when it comes to HTML and CSS, especially because these standards are living, breathing standards that change all the time. All right, so I'm going to dedicate this last 15 minutes here pretty much to a Q&A. Let's start with asking questions more focused on the content from today, so HTML and CSS. And then if we do have some time, I'm happy to broaden them out to more web development generally, questions about web development generally. So yeah, I'm gonna open up the chat here, and I'm just gonna start reading off the questions and answering them as I see them. Please provide us a complete roadmap of web development. I'm gonna say that's a bit broad right now. Let's focus on HTML and CSS. Where can we find these creative images? Actually, this is slightly beyond the scope, but I think it is super important, especially if you want to try doing something similar to this yourself. I use a source called unsplash.com. So these are free to use even without attribution. So you're fine to just grab these images and use them anywhere you want. I mean, you should attribute them if you actually use them in a real website that people look at. But legally speaking, you are fine to use all these. And there are very stunning, beautiful images that you can just use whenever you want. Is there any instance where you would use inline or embedded CSS formatting, or would you always use an external style sheet? So what Jason is referring to here is, as you guys noticed probably, hopefully, when we were writing the website, we were doing it in an external file, not in the index.html. But we actually can write CSS directly in our HTML file using a style element. So if I go here into the index.html, in the header here, I can actually just go style. Whoops. I can actually just create the style element like so, and anything I write in here will be interpreted as CSS. So I can just go display none, and then we will literally just destroy the whole web page, hide the whole web page like that, etc. So you can just define your styles inline. And what I would say is basically, you should use inline CSS if it's doable. I mean, it's simpler in a way, it keeps everything centralized, but the second that you're actually building a big project and like you need to get to your style sheet and you're scrolling through a document trying to find the right area in your document to edit, that's a huge pain in the butt. A tab system like this, where they're in separate files, is just much more manageable, really. And in a real project, we might even split up our styles even more. So we might separate our style sheet out into a bunch of different smaller style sheets, each of which only style a particular element. Ultimately, it just comes down to what's useful to you and what makes the most sense to you intuitively. But keeping things as separated out as possible and as easy to navigate is important. And that's why people tend to avoid using inline CSS. What is good for the backend, JavaScript or jQuery? Again, slightly beyond the scope of this. Is this responsive? Not at all. We know that because if we start changing the width of the page here by just resizing our browser window, it kind of starts looking weird. So if we go to a mobile size, it's looking not so great anymore. So it's not responsive. That's another lesson for another day, I guess. But basically, it's just going to come down to setting specific CSS styles which are applied on phones. I have learned HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which I learned after this. You should learn something like Angular. I believe Vivek mentioned that there's a really fantastic live training that Eduonix offers coming up with Angular. And these are sort of the frameworks that you should go to for more complex things, like building web apps, really like actual dynamic things that offer services. Something like Angular or React or Vue is what I would recommend doing after you have the web basics of CSS, HTML, and JavaScript down. How do you follow me on social media? So I will go ahead and send out my Twitter and LinkedIn if anyone wants to reach out, talk about tech, show me any projects you might have. Whatever, I'm always super interested to connect with like-minded programmers. So I'll be sending my Twitter, and right now I'm just typing it out, my Twitter and my LinkedIn in the chat for everyone to add me afterwards if they want to. There you go. So that's my LinkedIn and Twitter. Go ahead and follow me there if you're interested in keeping up with what I'm doing, or if you just want to talk. Can we watch this live session later? Yes, you absolutely can. We will be publishing it on the Eduonix website, so you can use. You can also reference the code itself that we used to build this website, the presentation files that I gave, and the actual session recording will all be available to you. Which method is better according to you for background images, from linking or from CSS URL? I guess you're asking, should we use the background image CSS value or use an IMG in the actual file? There are arguments for both. The nice thing about using the IMG element within HTML is that you can sort of set some things like, in terms of responsiveness, in terms of loading different images based on the screen size. You can improve your website loading times if you do that correctly. But the background image system is slightly more powerful. You can also get the responsive thing set up if you know what you're doing, but it is slightly more work. So it comes down basically to the use case. If you just start messing around and trying to use them, you'll sort of see when and where each thing is more doable. Is it essential to minify CSS and JS on a production server? Absolutely. I mean, it just makes sense. Make your files as small as possible. Would I recommend Angular, React, or Vue? I think it really comes down to what you're like as a developer. I prefer React just because I've used it more, and also because I like to have a little more control over my over things like which routing library I use in state management. But that's very, very far beyond the scope of this. Do I suggest any books for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? I've been reading a really interesting book about JavaScript. What is it called? It's about scopes and closures. Man, I'm sorry. I wish I had the name for you, but I actually don't have it on me right now. but yes, there are lots of really good books on JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. Honestly, I'd recommend specifically not to read books about HTML and CSS just because, again, like you should just get good at Googling that information. It's not really useful to memorize. But JavaScript has a lot of really interesting things to learn about how it works under the hood and all of the ECMAScript specifications that keep getting updated. So definitely worth checking out. So that looks like pretty much all the questions from the chat. So I'm going to pass it back over to our wonderful host to close off the session. Remember to follow me on the social media accounts I linked. And thank you guys for being such a fantastic audience. So Vivek, I'm gonna pass it back to you now.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Gray, and really appreciate your kind words for me. Well, yes, guys, don't go away anyway because as I mentioned to you, we have got the not just the giveaway, we also have the registration link. So quickly, I am just sharing my screen. I hope you can see. Yep. Okay. So just to cover up, on the 3rd April, we have something called as the Angular E degree, which is like a 2 hour on a Saturday and 2 hours on a Sunday session, which is going to be a live training from one of our reputed instructors. Her name is Aarti, and she would be the one who will be, taking your Q&As. She will be a part of your mini assignments. She will be also providing you a certificate at the end of this wonderful course, which is an industry verified course. By the way, these are the few industry projects which are actually a part of that Angular E degree, which you will be part of. So without taking much time, I'm just opening the chat quickly, and I will be able to share the link for registration very quickly. Guys, just let me know if you're able to open the link. I have got the link um, added with a discounted offer. By the way, this is the how a certificate looks in case you are completing your E degree with Eduonix. And yeah, so just as I mentioned quickly, here we go. Just opening the chat right now. Guys, let me know if you are able to open the link which I've just shared with you right now. Just put a yes if you are able to open and register yourself. And please let me know whomsoever are able to. Great, I see a yes coming from a couple of them. Yeah, many people are actually mentioning a yes on the chat. Thank you. Guys, make sure these are limited seats so you don't miss out on the opportunity. As you know that I have actually added an offer in order to have you guys enroll for this. Let me tell you that the offer is not valid for very long. This is a very limited offer because if you see, the prices were actually $149 for the seats, and then it actually was knocked down to $99 on the website. But now just for the webinar, you will be able to get it for 66 or around $69 approximately, if I'm not wrong. So $66 is the price which you can actually get this. What's more, I am definitely going to share a link for a free course wherein you will be able to just enroll for the course as well for free. That's open to you right now as well. So here is the link for that. uh, Also, make sure that you are enrolling for this course. Yeah, Steve, I agree to that. I am so sorry. I mentioned $66, but it shows 69. Yeah, it's actually 69. I'll be very clear with you. So sorry if I've got, given a wrong information, but it's actually $69. So guys, just enroll and quickly let me know here on the chat right away if you have enrolled for it. One more time, just for the sake of everyone who may have missed out the link before. Here you go. The link is here for registration. Just make sure that you are able to enroll yourself very quickly. By the way, one quick thing I wanted to inform you that the PPT, the the notes as well as the recording of the entire session will be passed on to you within the next 24 hours of this session on your Eduonix dashboard. So you will get this on your Eduonix dashboard. Do not worry. Just make sure that you go through it at your own leisure whenever you are, if you have not found anything. And in case you have any questions, always reach out to our chat box, which is on eduonix.com. If you just open eduonix.com, you'll be able to see the chat box. You can just reach out to our very helpful support staff to guide you. Jeff says, will you later have a MERN stack class versus this mean stack class? I need to learn MERN for my job. Thanks. Jeff, just to answer this question, I will take this feedback and I'll share it with the instructors, the pool of instructors which we have for the relevant thing. I will make sure that we can cover this up for you, but I cannot commit on the date as of now. Stay tuned with Eduonix. You will definitely get an update about the topic which you asked for. Adam is asking, are we getting a certificate for this workshop? No. I'm afraid this is a free session. You definitely get a free giveaway course, but certificate is for the live training, which you will be starting for the 3rd of April. Yes, Akash, I see your question. I'm a beginner, so can I take your classes? Yes, this will be definitely covered for a beginner as well. Jeff, your question says, will you be having more free sessions like this in future? Definitely. We do have weekly sessions, or rather, at least 3 to 4 sessions for free in the month, each month throughout 2021. So stay tuned. As I mentioned, just follow our social handles, or maybe just follow eduonix.com. You'll be able to see a lot of sessions being uploaded and a lot of invites being shared on for free training as well. Akash, next class, I think the next class is going to be the live session, which is going to be the 3rd of April. So make sure you enroll for it. One more time, just for the benefit, one last time, I'm sharing the registration link. Just anyone raise your hand if you have actually made it and registered yourself for the 3rd of April. How long? Okay, SM Abtabi, if I've got this name correct. Sorry. How long the node free courses will stay in the dashboard? So the free giveaways are during the session only. That's just like a token of appreciation from Eduonix to ensure that you guys are benefiting not just from the training, but you take away some free giveaway goodie from us. So that's only valid for the session. Um, Snehal has to say, how do we know about a free session? Okay, you can follow eduonix.com on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. Uh, there is definitely updates about the free sessions which are coming up well in advance, and you will also, if you're registered or enrolled, you will also get email notifications coming from us as well. So keep yourself open and make sure you register for the free session as well. Mansoor, what's the duration for this course? I think it's about 5 weeks, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, it's I think about 5 weeks. Is there a course for full stack? Shan is asking me this question. Is there any course for full stack web development on Eduonix? Yes, Shan, there is. What I would request you is you can just write to me on this email address, Shan, and I will just share the link with you to enroll for the full stack web development. All right, guys. One more thing: our team always tries to make the best out of the session. So any feedback from you would be appreciated. Be it the instructors, be it Eduonix, be it how the session was conducted. be it any feedback which you feel should be added. Anything, you can just add it to the feedback form which I have just shared with you. Nicola has a question. Does monthly subscription include live sessions? I'm sorry, Nicola, no, they don't include that. So guys, it's about time, and we should wind up now. So a special thanks from me on behalf of all of you for being such a lovely audience. Thanks to our lovely evergreen instructor, Gray, who's always been so fascinating and so lovely to work with, as well as he's such a lovely trainer. So make sure that you guys are attending the upcoming free sessions. You will be updated via email, via all the social media platforms, or all our official handles. And also, if anyone has missed out, I am also sharing the same registration link on your email right now, which is valid for the next 3 hours only. So the next 3 hours from now, you will be able to avail this offer to get $69 for this lovely Angular e-degree session. All right. So Gray, anything before we end this session? If you have anything, just let me know.
Um, yeah, not anything super substantial to say, but thanks everyone for showing up, and thanks Vivek as always for being such a fantastic and welcoming host.
Thank you, Gray, for the kind words, and really appreciate, and I love to have such wonderful sessions with you. Welcome to each and every one of you next time around. So I'll take everyone's leave. Thank you, Gray. Thank you, the audience, and you've been really, really supportive. Mo has one question. Do your support reply to our emails? Yes, they do. Mo, being a weekend, possibly the chat service may not be open at the moment, but I recommend you can just write to me on my official email address. I'm just putting my official email address on this right now. Okay, so it's vivek.prabhu@eduonix.com. You can just write to me. I'll pass it on to my support team, who can guide you with any information you may have. No problem, Mo. I apologize. You didn't get an instant reply because it's a weekend and the chat support may not be active at this moment. I recommend you just write to my email address. I'll pass it on to this. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Snehal, and we will end this session today. I appreciate everyone's attendance and patience today with me and Gray today. Thank you. Mo, I'm sorry if it was a week ago. I really apologize for that. Just write to me on my email address I just mentioned to you on this. I'll take it forward with the support team, and we'll ensure that someone gives you a response immediately. All right. Okay. Thank you, everyone, guys. Have a great day ahead. Have a lovely weekend, and we'll connect once again in the next session. Stay tuned on our official social media handles to get an updates from Eduonix for all the updates for next free sessions. Thank you, and have a lovely day. Thank you.